What's going on, guys? Scar coming at you with another Magic the Gathering video. Today's video, we dive into a video I actually already made once on the channel, but I'm actually going to be redoing it just because some of the feedback I got, it wasn't as helpful as I thought it was going to be. I didn't really have a structure of exactly how I was going to put the video together, but today's video I actually drew an outline. We are going to be diving into the new player experience for newer players in Magic the Gathering and or Arena. And this video here is going to be going into the various steps of a Magic the Gathering game, kind of giving you the basics, kind of to get you started, to give a bit more of a understanding of exactly how a Magic game works. And at the end of the video, I'm going to have a couple tips for those newer players if they want to dive there, kind of get a few tips to help them build upon to kind of become better Magic the Gathering players. With that being said, guys, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to know I post new videos on the channel like this one, hit that subscribe button and you'll be notified when I post new videos on the channel. With that being said, guys, let's dive into the video and let's talk about it. So, I mean, you are here because you want to know a little bit more about what is Magic the Gathering, or what is Magic the Gathering Arena, whatever version of Magic the Gathering you are playing, you want to know more about it. Essentially, the basics of Magic the Gathering is that it is a card game that consists of, typically when you play the cards, it is two players who go against each other with 60 card decks, and the goal is to eliminate the other player by reducing their life total down to 0. Each player starts at 20 life. That is kind of like the general basics of how a Magic game works. There are other formats, but for simplicity things, we're just kind of going over a general game of Magic. We're not going to go into the various formats and what cards can and cannot be played in those formats. So just to kind of give you a little bit of the basics to help you out there. Also, this is going to be great for players who are new to the game, or even players who are just coming back after having a long hiatus, just because, you know, you're stuck at home, need something to do, and you decide to jump back into Magic because you can play it on your computer. Hopefully this video will help you out a lot. I actually have chapters for each part of this video. You may actually already see them, so depending on what part you're looking for, you can always jump ahead and kind of get the understandings of what's going on. So we're moving into the first phase, and that is how to start playing Magic the Gathering. So essentially, the easiest way to play Magic the Gathering as a newer player is either one, if you want to play physical Magic the Gathering, you can go out and buy, you know, a starter deck. If you have a friend who's trying to get you to Magic the Gathering, maybe they have an extra deck that you can play with, you know, just to get your you know, the ground wet. They could probably help you learn the game, you know, with their deck, kind of help you with like how to play. You can always play Magic the Gathering Arena. It is a free client. You don't actually have to invest any money into Magic the Gathering Arena if you don't want to. The game does give you 5 free starter decks that you get through the new player experience, and you unlock more as you play more of the game and do various daily quests to unlock more decks, and then slowly build up your collection that way. So I mean, those are some interesting ways that you can actually physically start to play Magic the Gathering, and I actually personally enjoy the ways that you don't have to commit anything until you're really sure if you really do enjoy the game or if it's a game for you. I also don't find starter decks to really be that useful. Sure, they're great, but a experienced Magic player typically doesn't buy a starter deck whenever there's a new one that comes out. But it's great for a player who maybe just wants to start. Maybe you and a friend want to start, you each buy one, but it's just more of an entry way. But eventually you're going to want to build upon that starter deck and kind of build something a little bit better than what a starter deck has to offer. Moving on to the next part, we're actually going to talk about how to play Magic the Gathering. Like, what is a typical game of Magic the Gathering? We're going to kind of break down on how the general basics go from the start of the game to the end of the game. And then eventually I'm going to go into like the various phases of a turn and kind of break down each one of those phases for you to kind of give you a better understanding of what they are. So the first and foremost, the way a Magic the Gathering game starts is that you play against another player, typically an opponent of one other person. You will do something to decide who goes first. I know at MTG Arena, they kind of auto decide for you as you get into the game, but typically in physical Magic, you either flip a coin, you can roll a randomized dice, you could play rocks, paper, scissors, you know, some sort of way that you guys can figure out how to play a physical game of Magic, you know, and determine whoever wins or declare, you know, flip, you know, calls the heads or tails, you know, you can figure out who goes first. Then from there, you essentially each shuffle your 60 card deck, shuffle it up, randomize it. In like tournament play and, you know, sanctioned play, you typically give it to the other player, and then they go about and they kind of either shuffle it or they cut the deck in half or something like that. Just kind of, you know, make sure your shuffle is legit. You're not trying to stack certain cards up on certain areas of the deck. That's just one of those things you may notice if you decide to play sanctioned Magic. Next up, you go about, you each then take your deck back, you then go each draw your opening hand. Typically, you know, the player who who is going first, they actually look at their hand first and decide if they want to keep the hand or if they want to mulligan. Essentially, mulligan is a rule that if you don't like the 7 cards that you drew, you essentially take that hand, you shuffle it back into your library, you shuffle your library back up, and then you draw a new 7. If you like that hand, you then take a card from that hand, you actually put it on the bottom of your library, typically a card that they probably don't need immediately, or if you have multiple copies in your opening hand, you probably don't need multiple copies of, and you put it on the bottom and then you go about it. You can continue this process as many times as you need to redraw a new hand, but every time you do this, you then put an additional card on the bottom of your library. So if you mulligan 7 times, you eventually have no hand, you're just handless. But I would say, mulliganing once or twice, depending on your hand, is okay, especially, just kind of get an understanding. If you're also playing a friendly game, maybe your opponent will maybe your friend or opponent will let you get a free mulligan in. That's fine. I know, especially if you're a newer player, that's one of those things. I mean, in Arena, you don't get that luxury unless the game mode itself that you're playing in has a free mulligan, but most game modes, I believe, you mulligan. It's this typical mulligan rule. After each player decides that they want to keep their opening hand, you move on to the first turn. So the player who goes first, they go and they start their turn. The player who goes first actually doesn't draw a card, they actually just immediately go into their turn. That is the one disadvantage of going first, but there's also advantages of going first, but that's a different discussion for a different video. So essentially, the player is able to play up to 1 land a turn unless they have a card that says otherwise. They can play a spell, which is a creature, artifact, sorcery, or instant. If they play a land, they play their creature or their spell. If they don't have anything else, they pass the turn. It goes on to the next player. Then player 2 goes. Player 2 then draws their card, because player 2 gets to start the normal rules of Magic. If they draw the cards, so they go up to 8 cards in their hand. They follow the same thing as player 1, which they can play a land, and then follow that up with you playing a spell or a creature of some sort, and then essentially passes on back to player 1. And this keeps on going back and forth essentially until you start building a board with creatures and things like that, and you start trying to target your opponent's life total and try to get them down to 0. Now, sure, there's other ways that you can actually win a game of Magic other than moving your opponent's life total down to 0. I know in Call Time, for example, we're getting something called poison counters, but that's another discussion for another video. But the other ways that you can win is if you actually have no cards in your deck left at the end of the game. So essentially, if you can't draw a card because you have no cards left in your deck, you actually lose because you have no cards left in your deck. The other way, there are a couple cards in the game that are currently in Magic that you actually, if a certain thing happens, you lose the game via that. That is another way. But the typical way is you get down to 0 life points, and that's how you lose a game of Magic. So next, we're moving on to actually, how does a turn essentially work? What are the different phases of a turn? How does each phase work? You see all these little icons possibly be playing an MTG Arena that kind of slide around as you play your turn, but kind of getting a better understanding of how these phases work will definitely help you out becoming a better player. So the first phase of any turn, we'll just say, not just the first turn, but any turn, is actually called the upkeep / beginning phase, and that's actually broken into 3 different parts. There's the untap or the upkeep phase, which essentially is where this is the phase where you untap the lands that were tapped from the previous turn. Then this is where you untap any creatures or permanents that were tapped down, unless there's a spell on any of these permanents that say you can't untap them during your upkeep. Then you move on to your upkeep, which essentially is just an area where anything that happens at the beginning of your turn, this is where it happens. So if you have like a spell that has something happen at the beginning of your upkeep, I think Birth of Meletis is a good one. It's one of those Saga cards, which I'll pop up on the screen. Essentially, it goes from Saga 1 when you play to Saga 2 in this phase, and then so on and so forth until it runs out. That is something that happens at the beginning of your upkeep. There's other cards that have other abilities, and you'll kind of see them as you start playing more Magic and kind of start collecting more Magic cards. Then after that, you move on to the draw phase, and this is where you draw your card for the turn, unless you go first, of course. This is where you draw your card and go up to you go up to at least 8 cards, and if you're on second. If not, you go you just refill your hand back up 1 card. Now we move on to the first main phase / second main phase, because technically these 2 phases are actually the same, just one happens pre-combat, the one happens post-combat. So sometimes you may hear pre-combat step and the one maybe post-combat step, depending on who you're talking to. People have different slang and lingo for how games work, but one happens before combat, one happens after combat. Essentially, this is the phase where you get to play the land. This is the phase where you get to play your creatures. This is the phase where you get to play your sorcery spells. Instant spells work differently, and there's also creatures that can be played at different points. Also, planeswalkers and artifacts can also be played in this phase. And that essentially is what happens during your first main phase. After each player passes and no one has any plays during the main phase, yes, your opponent can play things in your main phase too if they have an instant spell that actually does something to interact with your main phase. You technically move on to your combat step. This is where if you have any creatures that are able to attack. Also, side note, the turn you play a creature, it actually has summoning sickness, so it can't actually attack the first turn it comes into play unless it actually says something called haste, which is an ability that gives a creature the ability to attack the turn it comes into play. So other than that, essentially any creatures that have been at least on the battlefield for a turn, this is the step where they can actually attack. The combat phase now is broken down to multiple parts. So essentially you may hear in physical magic, you may say, I'm moving to my combat step, or I declare, I'm moving to combat. This is essentially, the player whose turn it is telling the other player that, hey, it's now we're going to go to attacks. And this is where, if you're the other player, this is where you want to do anything that kind of prevents creatures from attacking in any way. If you want to tap down any creatures, you want to move any creatures, because some creatures also have abilities that will trigger when they attack or at the attack step. So if any point, if you haven't done anything to remove that creature, that ability is going to be able to trigger. So the player whose turn it is going to declare attackers. This is where they take their creatures and they tap them into attack step. And in a way, you're only attacking the player, or if they have a planeswalker. If they have a planeswalker, you have to decide if you're attacking the player or the planeswalker. So that is where you're going to delegate where your damage is going. But typically, you're just attacking into the player. You're not actually attacking you're not attacking creatures like you may see in other card games. But this one, you're just going straight to the player's life total. Then after you declare your attackers, it moves over to your opponent, who then declares if they have any creatures on the battlefield, what creatures those creatures are going to block. So they put creatures in front of. Also, side note, if you have declared an attacker or your opponent has declared a blocker on a particular creature and you decide to use a removal spell that actually, destroys target creature or removes it, from combat, after it's already been declared an attacker and or a blocker, it's already been declared. You can't actually remove it from combat per se. So if you decide your opponent's going to block with this particular creature, well, I'm going to burn that creature. It's already declared a blocker, the damage is going to be nullified unless it has an ability that can actually go around that damage, like Trample is one. Trample is an ability that kind of does damage, if it does more damage than the player's toughness on the creature. I feel like I'm giving it a lot of abilities. I'm sorry, I do apologize. But this is where essentially now your opponent decides what creatures are going to block, and then they kind of just go from there. Once all creatures have been assigned blockers, we now move on to the damage phase. This is a phase where actually all damage is done simultaneously. Unless cards have first strike or double strike, everything's done at the same time. So if you have creatures that block each other, this is where you assign the combat damage. And if any creatures are unblocked, this is where their damage gets done to the player and your life total goes down. Also, with that noted, the other thing too to note here is after this phase, there is the cleanup phase of the combat step. This is essentially any creatures that have their toughness reduced down to 0. This is where they go to the graveyard. Any planeswalkers where their loyalty's gone down to 0, they also go to the graveyard. And then we move on to the second main phase. The second main phase is essentially the same thing as the first main phase, but you can essentially now play things after combat. Certain players do play things after they have attacked if they want to kind of set something up. Maybe they want to see if your opponent's going to remove a spell, kind of tap out their mana or something like that during their combat, and then they go ahead and they play like maybe their next spell, or then they play the land. There's certain tricks and tactics you can use during your second main phase that kind of gives kind of is like a way to bluff your opponent. Maybe you just didn't draw anything, you don't have anything to play during your first main phase. After your second main phase, you actually move to the end step. The end step is technically the area where we clean up everything that's happened during the turn. So if you are the player, this is where anything that has at the end of turn, this is where those abilities start triggering. The other thing too is if you're the player whose turn it was, if you have more than 7 cards in your hand, you discard down to 7 unless there's a card that you may have played or have in play that says you can have a hand larger than 7. Any damage that was assigned during combat damage that didn't kill any creatures is actually now wiped off those creatures. And after that, the turn moves back to the other player. So that's, essentially in a Magic turn. I know it's a lot to take in, and just playing it is probably the best way to kind of really understand how it works, kind of seeing how each step works. I know in the Arena client, a lot of it's kind of automated, where you kind of don't really see how each step works out. If you're playing Magic, in person, you kind of do see how each of these steps do work out because you physically see it, and you can kind of there's not as much automation, so each step kind of goes a little bit slower, so you can kind of process it and kind of understand a little bit more. Now we're moving on to the tips. These are some of the tips that I figure are good for newer players to kind of help them understand, help them out to start out with their new Magic the Gathering experience. And the first one is actually understanding the deck you're playing, or understanding the game plan that you're trying to set forth into what you're trying to do against your opponent. So every deck, it has a strategy of how they're going to win. Aggro decks, for example, they play very aggressive. Their goal here is to hit their opponent as fast as possible, as hard as possible, and try to end the game early as possible. On the reverse side, we have decks that are called control decks. They play a little bit of a slower game. They want to play spells that are going to bounce creatures back to your opponent's hand. They want to play spells that, counter spells that your opponents are playing, which are essentially they don't get played. They cast them but get countered during the casting time. They also want to play spells that possibly remove creatures from the battlefield, essentially playing anything like a board wipe, which essentially, destroys all creatures on the battlefield. Play spells that singly target, remove a creature, whether it's a direct removal spell or it's a burn spell. Those are things that typically a control deck wants to do, because they want to set up the game so that they're in control, and they kind of let things happen for certain reasons. They're trying to take control of the game, essentially, is the process. And sure, this is something that you'll kind of understand as you play more and more in Magic. And with that being said, I mean, the more you play, the more knowledge you get, and the better you understand on how these strategies do work. To kind of follow that up, another thing is players who are new to the game, as they get understanding of how certain cards work and certain decks work, they may pick up on some of the things like, well, this deck's playing these colors, so they must be playing these cards. And that's the thing, like, as a Magic the Gathering player, you want to, as much as you want to play around cards, if you're still trying to set up what you're trying to do during your game plan, you don't want to put a particular if your opponent has drawn a particular card in the way of you playing what you're trying to do. If they go ahead and they play it, good on them. They had the card that you were worried about. If they don't, now you may have put pressure on your opponent. Now they have to deal with what you have, and they have to draw into that card that you were so worried about. So it's a game just like any other card game that you can bluff your opponent. So if they have open mana, you may think, oh man, they must have that. But at the end of the day, until you challenge them with that, there's no way of knowing until they play it. So that is one of those things that I feel like a lot of newer players do once they kind of understand what certain decks do. I'm going to play around that card, and no worries to me. And in this process, your opponent may just take advantage of this, whether they get extra turns to draw, possibly the card that you were so worried about, or they just take advantage of you and put too much pressure on you, and you have too much pressure on you to actually come back from, and you end up losing. Kind of going on to the first part is actually another thing too, is understanding your hand and your game plan is mulligan bad hands. And what that means is the hand that you have, is it going to help you get to the end goal of your game plan? If you have an aggro deck and you don't have a first turn play, you don't have a play until your third turn, that's probably not going to be a good aggro deck, because the idea here is you don't want to be like, hey, if I draw this card, this hand's now good. You want to be like, okay, these 7 cards, are these going to be the cards that are going to take me to possibly the end of the game where I win? That is one of those things. At the same time too, if you want to play a multicolor deck that has more than one color, you don't want to have all the one color but none of the other color. At the end of the day, you draw that other color, you have other spell of that other color, you can't play because you don't have the land. So now you have to worry about now drawing the land to play that particular spell. It's just one of those things. You're going to be flooded with cards in your hand that you just can't play, and that's also going to prevent you from doing what you're trying to do. To wrap this up, next, I don't know how many times, the best way to become better at Magic the Gathering is just practice. Practice, practice, practice. I mean, you're not going to become the best Magic player just by picking up the first deck you play and pretty much win everything. It's going to take practice to understand, the game itself, build the knowledge of what the collection of cards there are in Magic the Gathering, and just understand how opponents play certain cards and certain decks and how certain things do. The game's always evolving. Whenever they introduce a new set, the whole meta itself shifts around, and what decks are good, what decks are bad, what cards are good, what cards are bad, are always shifting. Sure, some of the older sets and older styles of gameplay, they don't really shift around a lot, but like something like Standard, which is typically the general game mode a lot of newer players play in Magic because it's the fewest cards you have to collect, it's always shifting every time they release a new set because there's so many sets in a particular Standard. Like I said, guys, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. If you want to help support the channel, I do have a join button. I don't, if you want, it's no big deal, but until next time, I'll see you in the next video.